Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 204, February 3rd to February 9th, 1864. Last week we discussed a handful of events, including the passing of the 13th Amendment. We checked in on what Sherman has been doing in Georgia, and also talked about Frederick Douglass. This week we will return to Virginia. We need to talk the Hampton Roads Peace Conference, as well as the Battle of Hatcher's Run. But first, before we do all that, we need to talk about John Breckinridge. And before we get into the former Vice President of the United States, do need to speak a little bit on our Patreon content. And here in February, we are actually going to be posting another statistical episode. This one's a little bit different. We did a statistical analysis a while back, and it was mostly about battlefield casualties in different battles. This one's going to be slightly different. We just have a whole bunch of different stats from the war that I found interesting in the course of researching. So hopefully you will find that interesting as well. We'll talk a little bit about those. We've done movie reviews in the past. January, we just did Gone with the Wind. And we've also done picture slideshows of modern-day battlefields, as well as memoir reviews too, talking about individuals who participated in these events and what they wrote afterward or during the war. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. On February 6, 1865, Breckinridge is going to be named the Confederate Secretary of War. Now, the Confederate cabinet has been seeing a lot of turnover, especially at the Secretary of War and Secretary of State positions. You can kind of chalk that up to Jefferson Davis being sort of difficult to work with. Obviously, there are those who were in the cabinet and they've resigned to do other things, right? But Jefferson Davis, a little bit of a micromanager, has that reputation, and so you have a lot of turnover here. Breckinridge would be a solid choice, though, having served as the U.S. Vice President. But it's a little too late for the Confederacy. What is interesting, though, is that we can briefly highlight the career of Breckinridge during the war. Now, we mentioned Breckinridge all the way back in the beginning episodes, him being a champion for Kentucky, especially a potential of Kentucky joining the Confederate States. He serves with Bragg, which gets him on the naughty list at Stones River, his Kentucky troops paying the price for the failed invasion of the Bluegrass State. Then he jumps around between theaters of the war, fighting at Chickamauga, where he turns in at least a decent performance. We can also kind of put a little asterisk there. He's actually given a pretty tough task on the second day of Chickamauga, attacking these well-fixed Union entrenched positions. The Orphan Brigade sees pretty heavy casualties. They see their commander fall during that piece of the action, right? So it's not necessarily Breckinridge's fault that these attacks fail, but this delay that we see on the second day is obviously what dooms them, because the Federals are able to certainly improve their defenses. And we talked about it actually way back in 1863 when we talked about Chickamauga, but in that particular sector of the field, there just weren't really a whole lot of Northern casualties. Later in 1864, Breckinridge is going to be shifted into the Southwestern Virginia Department, and then the main theater of the war. Surprisingly, for a political general, he is going to be competent, serving as a general officer, something that is commented on especially by the Army of Northern Virginia when he joins them for Cold Harbor. Breckinridge is certainly helped by the fact that he is able to turn away Franz Sigel in the Valley, part of that multiple-pronged offensive that Grant launches specifically in Virginia. So by the time he gets to Cold Harbor, by the time he shows up with these reinforcements, Lee needs kind of all hands on deck toward the end of the overland campaign. Breckinridge is there, and he does receive some pretty good marks by other members of the Army of Northern Virginia. And we've talked before about how there's a tribalism between these different armies. Often there's kind of a look down upon these individuals who come from outside of the Army of Northern Virginia. If you come from the West, there's not really a whole a lot of positive things you can say about them. So the fact that Breckinridge is able to come in, having served with Bragg, and then he does get these glowing reports by several members that I've seen. While he's not number one on my list of non-professional soldiers during the war, he has to at least be an honorable mention. Now that is weird, because at least in my mind, he's sort of just there, easily overlooked in some situations. You might disagree with that, but my point is in a world of general officers that serve to be a detriment of both North and South, and they're memorable because they mess things up, being just an average get-things-done guy is sometimes an appealing role to be in. So it's been a while since we were last in the vicinity of Petersburg, but it may surprise you to know that not much has changed. Grant is still going to stick to his plan of getting at the Confederate right. Remember, the cutting of the Weldon Railroad and any kind of traffic on the Boynton Plank Road would be key objectives to a successful siege by Union forces. There had been some forays on the Confederate left, but a lot of these were to pull troops away from the right and center, especially in the case of the Battle of the Crater that we talked about last summer. No, Grant was convinced that the right was still going to be the best course of action. Remember as well that part of the reason for shifting to Petersburg is that there's more room for maneuver. Sticking in the area north of the river would have restricted the tactical options. He would take the part of a boa constrictor and slowly squeeze out Lee, extending his lines in that direction. Long gone were the days of the grand assault, so using manpower to the advantage of the North would be important. Think too about all these battles that we've talked about here in the Petersburg campaign where the quality of the Union troops has certainly gone down. So unless there is an overwhelming numerical advantage, a clear-cut advantage from Grant, he's kind of limited in terms of these assaults. He can't do what he did at Cold Harbor because he's just going to not have the personnel for it. Warren's 5th Corps would be supported by Gregg's cavalry, and the 2nd Corps now commanded by Andrew Humphreys. Gregg at this point has already tendered his resignation, so this would be the last action of his career. The Union troops would shift to the west, Gregg's cavalry advancing toward Dinwiddie Courthouse, and from there would be able to sever the Boynton Plank Road, maybe snatching up some supply wagons in the process. Warren's troops, along with Humphreys, would advance down the Vaughan Road and dig in support. February 5th would mark the date of the action. The blue-clad soldiers, though, would see some obstacles, among which was going to be the Confederates and their desire to make sure the Boynton Plank Road was protected. Gregg's cavalry on the 5th gets to their destination, but the hunting being slim, they would return to the 5th Corps. Warren had done some skirmishing, but otherwise had seen some delays, including a destroyed bridge. Humphreys would see his troops pressed across Hatcher's Run. Heath's division and Gordon's corps, including Clement Evans and Pegram, would launch themselves at the Northerners. The Union troops had dug in sufficiently to fend off this strike. Unfortunately, though, the 8th New Jersey would be caught in the open and suffer heavy casualties. We do have an account from a member of that regiment. In the afternoon, we're relieved by a portion of Brevet Brigadier General Ramsey's brigade, and were passed in his rear. A few minutes past 4 p.m., we moved to the left of our former position and went into line of battle behind the extreme left of the works, with the exception of the left wing, which was without any protection, and formed the left of the brigade. Before the battalion had got into position, the skirmishers were driven in, and the enemy, keeping up a desultory fire, soon made their appearance. They were greeted with a terrific volley of musketry from our men and thrown into confusion. Again, they advanced in strong force, and notwithstanding the destructive fire poured into them, succeeded in gaining the shelter of stumps and fallen timber on our left, and for a time kept up a fatal fire on the exposed wing of the battalion. But they were forced to retire. They again made their appearance, seemingly determined upon carrying the line, but the well-directed fire checked them when within 80 yards of our works. They fought for some time, quite determinedly, but eventually gave way in confusion, suffering severely for the territory. The last repulse was after dark, and was the end of the engagement. Our loss was 11 killed and 38 wounded. Pickets were established, and the night passed in quiet, the enemy making no former demonstration. See how the language of the conflict has kind of changed here, sort of the nature of the fighting. You have a very strong account here where there are pretty heavy casualties for a unit that has part of its line exposed. It's not behind any kind of works or anything. And then you have an account here where the Confederates are seeking cover as they're coming forward. That wouldn't have been the case. These Napoleonic tactics, Victorian ideals of being manly and kind of facing the enemy, getting into a line, that's different now. They're doing some of these tactics that you might see with like light infantry in the French and Indian War even, right? Going from tree to tree in stumps and going from cover. Something else you probably see more in your modern conflicts as well, where you're not exposing yourself unnecessarily. Here we have General McAllister and his account of the action in the afternoon of February 5th. 4 p.m. received orders to form on the left of General Ramsey. I at once commenced the movement. My right regiments were just filling in when the attack was made on the picket line. I then ordered double quick and were moving in rapidly. Lieutenant Colonel William of Major General Humphrey's staff then informed me that there was a gap in the line between myself and Ramsey, caused by General Ramsey closing in the right. My rear regiment, the 11th New Jersey Volunteers, Colonel Schoonover, intended for the left of the line, was taken off and hurried into the gap. They received a fire from the enemy and returned it, causing the left of the enemy's advancing line of battle to falter and lie down. The fire was taken up all along the line as fast as my troops were informed. The pickets in my new front, having come running in without firing a shot, left the enemy right on us before I had my line completed. Regiment after regiment opened on the rebels as fast as they wheeled into position, causing their line to halt and lie down. The left regiment, the 8th New Jersey Volunteers, under command of Major Hartford, on the left wing of it, had no works, and were exposed to a terrible fire in this unprotected position. But they stood nobly, and fought splendidly. Not a man of this regiment, or indeed of the whole brigade, left for the rear. Major Hartford and his regiment deserve particular credit for their gallantry displayed in getting into position under the severe fire and holding it without works, while 2 regiments from the 2nd Division that had been lying for hours a little to my left on the approach of the enemy gave way without firing a gun, leaving much larger space without troops between my left and the right of the 2nd Division. So it might sound like a broken record yet again, but you see how you have this rookie regiment, supposedly these rookie regiments who don't fire a shot, they are going to withdraw. And then you have sort of the value in these veterans having seen combat before. They're able to stand even in a difficult position. So Warren with Gregg's cavalry would withdraw back to Humphreys. They would move back up the Vaughan Road and protect against the rebels, finding a soft spot. Meade was remembering some of these other actions in the vicinity where Billy Mahone, amongst other Confederates, would exploit a soft spot in their line. Warren on the 5th would see heavier action. While rebels pressed up the road itself, in the area of Dabney's Mill, Crawford's command would run into Evans and Pegram. While seeing some success, the rebels eventually would counterattack through wooded terrain and smash into the flank of the 5th Corps troops, scattering the Iron Brigade in the process. Pegram would be killed in the fighting, the Union troops escaping to safety. Warren would report a more controlled situation. I went along with the movement toward Dabney's Mill, to which place General Crawford soon joined the enemy. Rallying there, the enemy forced back General Crawford's left somewhat, when General Ayres was sent in his support on the flank with 2 brigades. The enemy was again driven, and to some distance beyond Dabney's Mill. The firing continuing now to be constant and severe, I brought up the 3rd Brigade of General Griffin's division in close support, and was obliged to pull it with General Ayres to hold our left. I sent then also at once for at least a brigade of General Wheaton's division, intending to order the whole division up if affairs in the Vaughan Road would permit. Unfortunately, however, the enemy got up reinforcements faster than I could, and when a brigade of General Wheaton's division was nearing the scene of action, a charge was made by the enemy in force, according to the Petersburg Express, consisting of 3 divisions, against which I had but 6 brigades opposed. Our line, despite all the exertions of the prominent officers and much good conduct amongst those in the ranks, gave way and fell back rapidly, with little loss after the movement began. Portions of the line continued to fire as it retired, and General Wheaton got up his brigade in line, and with a portion of the others reformed, so that the enemy was checked before our old lines were reached by us. The resistance the enemy's attacks met on the Vaughan Road, together with the vigor of our attack at Dabney's Mill, drew off all his troops to the latter place, which was the natural place for both his retiring columns to meet, as was our lines to run for our 2 columns in time, so as to have transferred our troops on the Vaughan Road to the enemy's right flank at Dabney's Mill. We should have driven him beyond the plank road with ease. As it was, a reconnaissance in force began nearly simultaneous by both parties, resulted in the enemy being repulsed on one road ourselves upon the other, which probably nearly equal losses. I must say our troops had stood as firm at Dabney's Mill as the best of them did, that I had enough there to have held the enemy till any amount of reinforcements could have arrived. On the whole, it was not a bad fight, and in no way discouraged me in my willingness to try the same thing again with these men. Nearly all the operations of the column toward Dabney's Mill I was an eyewitness to, and can speak of the good conduct of all these officers on whom I have heretofore relied. Let us remember that Warren had taken a lot of flack in the overland campaign, so he's going to want to mitigate the damages when reporting back to superiors. You can kind of tell as you read through this account, they kind of glosses over the negative things and says, there's a lot of excuses here at the end where he kind of says, well, he's probably equal casualties. We really didn't lose a whole lot of ground. He just has a lot of these kind of, well, yes, they did smash my flank, but I'd try it again. I'd go at it again with these same troops. They did a really good job. So again, he's trying to send this report and make it seem like less of an issue than it was, when in reality he's facing far less Confederate troops. They haven't victimized him like they did in the past, some of these other battles that we've seen in this particular sector, where, again, we mentioned Billy Mahone. He might have come up and smashed his flank. We've seen that happen a couple of times. So it's not quite to that degree. It's not disastrous in any way. They are able to stable the line, so that's pretty positive. But at the same time, you're probably stretching it a little bit if you're saying, well, I'm all good to continue the next day, when you know full well that Gordon here is in the area. He has Clement Evans, and Pegram's troops just perform well, so he might end up doing the same thing that Billy Mahone did, and nobody wants that. He can't really afford another disaster on his hands. And I think it is interesting when you see some of these reports and just how sugar-coated it is sometimes. This is certainly more of an example of that. By this point, too, Grant and Meade are not necessarily going to be fooled by this. They are well aware of the capabilities of their troops and their officers. Grant, obviously, again, does not have a very high opinion of Warren. Warren has kind of bumped heads with Meade as well, so there's going to be things that are going to come to a head here as we get into the Battle of Five Forks that we'll cover in a future episode. February 7th would see skirmishing, but little else. Lee was satisfied at defending the Boynton Plank Road, but the Union troops had extended their line closer to their destination. Winter conditions would make things worse, as sleet on the 7th would dissuade any further fighting. 14,000 Confederates had defended successfully, and even saw offensive success against some 35,000 Union troops, another example of the decline of the Army of the Potomac. Both sides would see limited casualties, only 1,000 approximately on both sides, but Hatcher's Run is a good example of the continued determination of Grant for his plan to succeed. In my mind, this is what makes Grant successful, is that he's going to keep trying, very similar to the Vicksburg campaign. If one plan fails, then we're going to move on to the next. Just keep this in mind as we move forward, that small gains are the new name of the game, hopefully continuing to crumble the rebel defense for our final strike. To close out this episode, we'll talk about the Hampton Roads Peace Conference. When we last left off, we had Francis Preston Blair getting the okay to start opening peace negotiations with the Confederacy. Lincoln would wish to wait until the fall of Savannah to begin, obviously wanting to continue to negotiate from a position of strength. Assuming Sherman is in Savannah too, he successfully completed his march to the sea, and we know there wasn't really a whole lot of Confederate resistance to his march to the sea. He has waged this kind of harder war, and it's going to be harder to stomach for the Confederates, and especially those who are going to be suing for peace. But the question still remained, how exactly would the two countries come together? And that verbiage right there is actually exactly the problem, in that these are not two countries. Certainly the Union is going to argue that they are the same country. The Confederates are going to say, no, we are our own country. So it is kind of this fundamental difference that is really going to hold up negotiations. And certainly you can see, like, these are rebelling states. They are still part of the Union. Lincoln needs them to remain in the Union. So we can't have this talk of two different countries. Blair had decided to use an alliance against France as a tool for peace. If we recall the Monroe Doctrine, a European foreign power having a presence in the Americas was something that at this time was still fresh in the United States. The doctrine read, "We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States." So essentially what this doctrine is saying is that if you mess with them, it's just like you're messing with us, right? We don't want you to be close to us, and certainly there is a lot of self-interest if you are the United States. If you're, at the time of this doctrine, you're a fledgling United States, you're still a relatively new country, you don't want Britain to establish a new colony. You don't want France to show up in Mexico and then just be there in Mexico on your border, right? And obviously, they didn't have Texas at the time, but, you get the idea. So getting rid of France's presence in Mexico was on the table. Ironically, France was also at this point trying to remove their support from Maximilian, if you remember our talks on the Great Intervention. Now, it is kind of an interesting what if, right? And I know there are some who are into history that don't like the whole what if scenario. Again, I've said it time and time again, I like the what ifs. But if we look at it from a French perspective, if they are staying in Mexico, if they're still backing Maximilian, we talked about it when we had the French intervention back in a previous episode, that Maximilian is not going to necessarily want to play ball with them as much. There's a lot of money that's going to be kind of sunk into Mexico, not a whole lot in return. So France is not necessarily keen on staying, but should they stay, and should they have this support of the Confederacy, right? Then you have the Union winning the war. Then you have a battle-hardened army, the largest that is going to be in the world. Remember, we talked about how France is considered to be the epitome of the military system, right? You had some of these battles in, say, the 1850s where they do a good job. There's a lot of countries around the world, including the United States, that actually base themselves off of the French army. Zouave uniforms, kepis, right? Is dressing like these French army guys. So you have that kind of connection. But you would have, again, the largest army in the world who has just defeated the Confederacy. Good generals, good army, right? You would have them showing up on the Texas border and saying, hey, it'd be really nice if you guys would get lost. So you have that, again, on the back of the mind of Napoleon III as well. Now you have Blair, who is going to suggest this, and the North is sort of going to feel some type of way about the French, but you should also remember that the South would also feel the same way. They are the same culture as the North. They're thinking very similarly when it comes to foreign powers. It's not like the Confederates have a policy that is different. So yeah, they're going to not like that France is there either. Now, they would have probably enjoyed more support from France during the actual war to get independence, but certainly there is a question that when the war ceases, how are they going to feel toward this foreign power? There are those who serve in the Confederacy and the Confederate government who don't like the French, even if they are going to help them. Now you had Blair from the North, but you also had Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president, who has been suing for peace for some time. So there's a good ally there, as well as Senator Robert Turner and John Campbell, the Assistant Secretary of War. These would be the men involved from the Confederate side during the peace talks, while William Seward would engage in these talks from the Northern side. Ironically, it was Stephens who had attempted to negotiate a peace back in 1863. These talks really went nowhere, and they were derailed by the Confederate loss at Gettysburg. But you can also kind of see it was a good time to maybe sue for peace from Alexander Stephens' perspective. The Battle of Chancellorsville had just happened. Lee was invading the North, so should there have been a victory at Gettysburg, then maybe there could have been some peace talks at that time. Stevens had also been a pre-war ally of none other than Abraham Lincoln, who would attend the conference, along with Seward, on the steamer River Queen near Fort Monroe at Hampton Roads, Virginia, on February 3, 1865. Now Lincoln would have two non-negotiables during this meeting. It would be that the South needed to lay down its arms and that it was to rejoin the Union. Interestingly, there were other things on the table. There were no recorded accounts of the 4-hour meeting, but reportedly, Lincoln would agree to compensate for the freedom of the formerly enslaved. William Seward would not agree with this compensation piece, but he would throw out that the 13th Amendment would actually possibly be derailed by the Southern states re-entering the Union. This was another interesting negotiation point. The amendment had passed, but it had not been popular. Lincoln would be feeling it from those against the amendment, those who were possibly on the Democratic side, and he was also feeling it from radical Republicans, who were angry he was even entertaining these conversations, wanting only unconditional surrender and nothing negotiated. The amendment might be delayed long enough for there to be some kind of deal struck with the remaining slaveholders in terms of compensation in maybe even 5 years' time. In all, these might have sounded like surprising terms, and even sort of generous in a way, set out by President Lincoln. But the Confederates were not going to be able to concede on the non-negotiables in the first place. There is always kind of this back and forth for the South fighting for rights or freedom, or what exactly is the purpose. At this stage, the writing was on the wall, but the commissioners could not concede, and so the conference would end with the only thing being decided as a reinstitution of some prisoner exchanges. The Hampton Roads Peace Conference is strange in that it does show the South wanting peace, and it shows just how far Lincoln was willing to go to gain peace, which really leads into the generous Reconstruction happening after the war. It's also kind of a what-if scenario, right? When you have Lincoln, what would have happened if he had continued as president, if he hadn't been assassinated? He has these very generous offers on the table. He just wants the country to go back together. We've already kind of accomplished emancipation, so he's willing to wheel and deal to make that happen. So let's go ahead and pause for today. We had the naming of John Breckinridge as the Secretary of War for the Confederates. We also had the Battle of Hatcher's Run, continuing the action around Petersburg. Finally, we had the Hampton Roads Peace Conference, which had some interesting points, but went nowhere to finish the war. Next week, we have a lighter episode, but we will cover more first-hand accounts. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.